Police are trained to handle theft, danger, and genuine crisis. But no amount of academy training can prepare an officer for a formal complaint against the wind for stealing a $20 bill. Today, we're exploring the official reports and bizarre requests that make law enforcement question everything. These are the moments when the thin blue line becomes the line between serving the public and starring in a surreal comedy. 1. In a call that defines misuse of emergency services, a woman dialed 911 from her bathroom in a state of sheer panic. She wasn't injured or trapped. She had simply run out of toilet paper mid-use and felt her situation had escalated to an emergency. She wasn't asking for medical assistance. She was requesting an officer be dispatched with a fresh roll, arguing that her predicament was, in her words, dire and required immediate aid from a first responder. 2. After a night out in Illinois, a man found his phone battery had died. Unable to call a cab, he chose the next logical option, 911. He requested a non-emergency police escort home, arguing that since he paid his taxes, he was entitled to a free ride. He wasn't in danger, he wasn't lost, he just saw the squad car as a publicly funded Uber. His request for a lift was politely, yet firmly denied. 3. A man in Arizona once called 911 to lodge a formal complaint against the sun. He claimed it was too bright and was making his day unnecessarily difficult. This wasn't a medical emergency. He was just philosophically opposed to the star at the center of our solar system doing its job. The dispatcher was left speechless, presumably because there is no official police protocol for issuing a citation to a celestial body for excessive luminosity. 4. Dispatch log, Vermont. A call was logged from a man reporting an unlicensed public performance. The performer was a local bird, a robin, that had been singing outside his bedroom window since sunrise. He angrily contended that the bird's incessant and off-key chirping was a clear noise violation. Since the bird obviously didn't have a permit for its sunrise concert, it needed to be fined and immediately removed from the premises. He wanted an officer to come and issue the citation directly to the avian offender. 5. A car thief in California failed a crucial step in his criminal enterprise. He forgot where he parked the Honda he'd just stolen. In a moment of sheer, unadulterated genius, he figured the best people to find his stolen car were the police. He called them, reported the theft, and even gave them the license plate. It didn't take long for the dispatcher to connect the dots and send officers to arrest the world's most forgetful felon. 6. In a moment of pure, uncut irony that folds in on itself, a man called 911 to report his neighbor. The reason? He could hear his neighbor through the thin walls, making a frivolous call to 911 about a cat stuck in a tree. The caller was furious that his neighbor was wasting valuable emergency resources. He failed to see that by calling 911 to complain about someone else misusing 911, he was committing the exact same offense, creating a perfect, beautiful loop of stupidity. Has a neighbor's sheer stupidity ever forced you to do something equally stupid? 7. In a display of baffling logic, a man in Texas locked his keys in his car and immediately called 911. He wasn't asking for help. He was informing them that he was about to break into his own vehicle with a coat hanger. He just wanted to give them a courtesy heads up, so they wouldn't mistake him for a real thief. The police arrived, confirmed it was his car, and then watched him fail miserably before suggesting he call a locksmith. 8. While getting a traffic ticket in Oregon, a driver decided the real crime was the officer's personal grooming. With the cop standing right there writing the ticket, the man called 911 to complain that the haircut was unprofessional and uneven. Outcome: the call was logged as unfounded. The driver received his original traffic ticket, plus a valuable life lesson on when to keep stylistic critiques to yourself. The officer's haircut, for the record, remained unchanged. 9. The digital age has spawned new types of non-emergencies. A woman in Ohio called 911 because she had forgotten her Facebook password and was locked out. She seemed to think the P in police department stood for password, genuinely believing they had a special unit for social media crises. Dispatch calmly explained that their jurisdiction did not extend to Mark Zuckerberg's servers and suggested she try the forgot password link, providing the best tech support of the day. 10. Proving no object is too inanimate to cause a disturbance. Police in Kentucky received a complaint about a snowman. A resident was so offended by a neighbor's winter creation that they called the cops. The issue? The snowman was anatomically correct, in a way not suitable for all ages. The caller insisted the frosty figure was guilty of indecent exposure and demanded its immediate removal, forcing officers to investigate a very cold case. 11. Here's a contender for the least self-aware 911 call in history. A man in Florida, while driving, called police to report a drunk driver who was swerving all over the road. He stayed on the line, giving the dispatcher a play-by-play of the vehicle's erratic movements. When the officer finally pulled the car over, he discovered the only person on that stretch of road was the caller himself. He had been reporting his own drunk driving, apparently believing he was a vigilant citizen fighting crime. 12. A man in Idaho tripped over his own feet on a perfectly flat sidewalk and immediately called 911. He wasn't injured, but he wanted to file a formal complaint against the force of gravity. He described it as an unregulated public nuisance that was being unusually aggressive in his immediate area that day. He seriously asked the dispatcher who was in charge of gravity for the city, and if they could please ask them to turn it down a bit. What's the most ridiculous thing you've ever tried to blame for your own clumsiness? 13. Police in Connecticut received a frantic call from a woman about a suspicious character on her property. The suspect wasn't a person, but a deer. It wasn't being aggressive or destructive, it was just standing on her lawn, eating her prize-winning petunias. Her complaint wasn't that the deer was simply there, but that it was loitering with intent. Intent to do what? She wasn't sure, but she was convinced it was up to no good and demanded an officer come and arrest it for violating city ordinances, as if it were a teenager hanging out in front of a 7-Eleven. 14. Police in Louisiana received a call from a man who wanted to evict his roommate. Standard procedure, except the roommate was a ghost. The caller claimed the apparition was months behind on its share of the rent, left ectoplasmic messes everywhere, and made spooky noises late at night. He genuinely expected the officers to serve an eviction notice on a non-corporeal being dead for 150 years. Who's the worst roommate you've ever had? 15. In what could only be described as a peak first world problem, a woman in California called 911 because her golden retriever refused to play fetch. She was convinced the dog was broken or staging some kind of protest. She requested an officer be sent to her backyard to motivate the canine, or at least document its insubordination. What's the most ridiculously human-like protest your pet has ever staged? 16. A woman in downtown San Francisco called 911 because she was being followed. When the dispatcher asked for a description, she said the suspect was wearing all black, had a stark white face, and wasn't saying a single word. It turned out she was talking about a street mime who was performing his act a few feet behind her. He wasn't touching or threatening her. She just found his silent, expressive movements deeply unnerving and wanted him arrested for disturbing her peace with his aggressive quietness. 17. A man from Ohio dialed 911 to report a case of psychological harassment. The perpetrator? A song that was stuck in his head. He claimed he'd had the same snippet of a melody on a loop in his brain for 3 days and it was driving him insane. He wanted police to make it stop and could only hum it badly off-key to the bewildered dispatcher. What's the one song that you absolutely cannot stand getting stuck in your head? 18. A would-be high roller in Nevada called 911, furious that the luxury watch he'd just bought from a man in a parking lot was a cheap fake. He complained that the gold was peeling and the second hand had already fallen off. He genuinely expected police to launch an investigation to recover the $100 he paid for a $10,000 timepiece. When officers arrived, he eagerly presented the shoddy watch as evidence, only to be informed that knowingly purchasing counterfeit goods is also a crime. 19. A woman in Kansas called the police to report a theft. The suspect she identified was the wind. She claimed a strong gust had snatched a $20 bill right out of her hand and disappeared with it down the street. She was dead serious, wanting officers to file a report and perhaps put out an all-points bulletin for an unusually aggressive pocket of low-pressure air, last seen heading east. 20. Neighborly disputes are common, but this one is special. A man in New Jersey repeatedly called the police because his neighbor was chewing too loudly. He described the sound as offensively loud and moist, and demanded an officer come over and tell the man to eat more quietly. This became a recurring issue, asking the department to serve as the unofficial mastication mediation squad, a role they definitely didn't train for at the academy. 21. A woman in a Chinese restaurant called 911 to report a clear case of fraud. The source of this criminal deception? Her fortune cookie. The slip of paper inside had guaranteed her a day filled with unexpected joy and financial gain. But as evening approached, with her day having been decidedly joyless and her bank account unchanged, she considered it a legally binding contract that had been flagrantly violated. She demanded an officer come down to the restaurant and hold the management accountable for its blatant false advertising and, in her words, prophetic malpractice. 22. A man in a quiet suburb called the police on his neighbor's lawn flamingos. His complaint wasn't about tacky decor, it was a full-blown conspiracy. He was utterly convinced that the specific arrangement of the plastic birds, how one was leaning, another facing the street, was a secret flamingo-based code used to communicate with a neighborhood crime ring. He insisted that an officer with a background in ornithological espionage was needed immediately to decipher their covert signals before an inevitable crime wave began. 23. A man called 911 to file a formal harassment complaint against his car's GPS. He claimed the female navigation voice was being deliberately passive-aggressive and had a condescending tone. The final straw was when it announced recalculating in what he perceived as a deeply sarcastic manner after he missed a turn. He genuinely wanted to know from the dispatcher what legal options he had, and if it was possible to get a restraining order against the disembodied voice in his dashboard. 24. Dispatch log, Michigan. A call came in requesting immediate officer assistance for a volatile domestic dispute. Upon arrival, the officer found a couple in the middle of a dangerously heated game of Monopoly. One partner had accused the other of embezzling from the bank and illegally moving their thimble game piece. They were at a standstill, refusing to continue until an officer, a neutral third party, could consult the official rulebook and make a legally binding ruling on the game's integrity. 25. A resident in Colorado called the police to report a squirrel. It wasn't rabid or trapped. It was just sitting on a tree branch outside his window, staring at him. For a full 20 minutes, the caller was utterly convinced the squirrel wasn't just gathering nuts, but was gathering intelligence and casing the joint for a future burglary. He described the animal's gaze as unsettlingly methodical and wanted the furry suspect apprehended for suspicious loitering. 26. A woman called 911 in tears to report that her favorite couple from a popular reality dating show had just broken up on the season finale. She claimed to be suffering from severe emotional damages, having invested weeks of her life in their fabricated romance. She accused the television network of committing emotional fraud by leading her to believe the relationship was real. She wanted to know if she could press charges against the producers for orchestrating the heartbreak that was now ruining her entire week. 27. A teenager in Florida made an emergency call to report a serious crime in progress. He was in the middle of an intense online match of Call of Duty and claimed his opponent was cheating. He insisted that camping in a virtual war zone was an illegal tactic and demanded the police track down the other player's IP address and arrest him. The dispatcher had to patiently explain that the Geneva Conventions do not, in fact, apply to multiplayer video games. 28. On the first Sunday of March, a man called 911 to report a grand theft on a massive scale. The stolen item? An hour of his life. He was furious about daylight saving time and insisted that the government had committed a coordinated, nationwide heist. He wanted to file an official police report, get a case number, and know what detectives were doing to recover the stolen hour that had been taken from him and every other citizen against their will, demanding justice for the lost time. 29. Dispatch log, Florida. A woman called 911 3 separate times because her McDonald's ran out of chicken McNuggets. To her, this wasn't a supply chain issue. It was a criminal injustice. She insisted it was an emergency, demanding an officer intervene. She wasn't seeking a refund. She was seeking justice. Outcome. After her third call, the final disposition was a stern warning for misuse of emergency services. Case closed on the Great Poultry Caper of 2014. 30. A man called his local police department on January 1st with a very unusual complaint. He was furious that the calendar he'd been using for the past year was now obsolete and useless. He viewed the annual passage of time as a cynical conspiracy by the calendar industry to force consumers to buy a new product every 12 months. He wanted to know if this forced obsolescence was legal and who he could sue for the emotional distress of having to buy a new calendar. 31. A man in Ohio called 911 to report that the large pepperoni pizza he had just received was not perfectly round. He wasn't complaining about the taste or the temperature. His issue was purely with its geometry. He claimed the noticeably ovular shape was causing him significant aesthetic distress and violated the implied promise of artisanal symmetry. He demanded an officer be dispatched with a tape measure and possibly a protractor to officially document this culinary crime for a pending lawsuit against the pizzeria for false advertising. 32. Police received a call about a public statue in a city park. The complaint wasn't vandalism or damage. A woman insisted the bronze statue of a town founder was staring at her judgmentally every single time she walked past. She was convinced its stony gaze followed her, silently critiquing her life choices and questionable fashion sense. Her request for the police to either force the statue to turn its head to a less confrontational angle or, failing that, arrest it for sustained psychological harassment. 33. A shopper at a grocery store called 911 from the checkout aisle, absolutely furious about the self-checkout machine. The machine was working perfectly, but that was precisely the problem. He reported that he was being subjected to forced unpaid labor by the store. He argued that scanning and bagging his own groceries constituted a job, and since he wasn't being paid minimum wage for his time, he wanted an officer to charge the manager with violating the Fair Labor Standards Act. 34. An Oregon family called 911, whispering that they were being held hostage in their bedroom. Their captor wasn't a masked intruder, but their 22-pound Himalayan cat. After the feline scratched their baby, it flew into a rage and was now guarding the doorway, hissing at anyone who dared to exit. Police actually showed up and had to use a snare to capture the fluffy tyrant, successfully liberating the family from their furry tormentor. 35. A man called 911 from a city park on a hot summer day to report a defective product. The product in question was his ice cream cone, which had melted and dripped onto his brand new shoe. He claimed the ice cream shop was engaging in blatant consumer fraud by selling a product that could not withstand standard environmental conditions. He wasn't looking for a refund. He demanded the police shut the entire parlor down for its blatant disregard for structural integrity. 36. After taking his car through an automatic car wash, a man in Florida called the police to report a major theft. The car wash hadn't stolen his wallet or his phone. According to him, it had done its job too well and washed off a lucky bird dropping that had been on his hood for a week. He was convinced this specific dropping was the source of his recent good fortune. like finding a prime parking spot, and wanted to file a report against the business for the malicious removal of a priceless good luck charm. 37. A man called the police requesting a full forensics team be sent to his living room. The critical incident: he and his wife were in a heated dispute over who had the TV remote last. With their favorite show about to start, he was adamant that an officer should come and dust the remote for fingerprints to scientifically prove who was telling the truth, and finally settle the argument once and for all with hard evidence. Let's be honest, who in your house is the absolute remote control tyrant? 38. During a small-town 4th of July parade, a man on the sidewalk called 911 to complain about the people on the floats. His issue wasn't the noise or the music. He was deeply offended because they were waving far too aggressively. He described their enthusiasm as insincere and provocative, and felt their overly joyous gestures were a form of public mockery aimed directly at him. He wanted the police to intervene and instruct the parade participants to tone down their happiness to a more reasonable level. 39. In Wisconsin, a woman dialed 911 in the dead of night to report a theft in progress. The stolen item? Her blanket? The audacious perpetrator? Her own husband, who had allegedly hogged it in his sleep. She treated it with the gravity of a home invasion. Official recommendation from dispatch: seek marriage counseling, not law enforcement, for blanket-related felonies. No units were dispatched. 40. A man at a city park called 911 to report a piece of fraudulent public information. He had come across a park bench with a wet paint sign on it. Out of what he called civic duty, he touched the surface and discovered the paint was completely dry. He viewed this not as a helpful, albeit outdated, warning, but as an act of brazen public deception. He demanded an officer come down and issue a citation to the Parks Department for misleading the public and causing him several moments of unnecessary caution. 41. A tourist in New Orleans called 911 from a seafood restaurant, demanding to press charges for blatant false advertising. The menu item in question was jumbo shrimp. He was irate because the shrimp he received were, in his words, merely large, not legitimately jumbo like a small lobster might be. He argued that the term jumbo constituted a binding legal description, not a casual adjective, and expected the police to measure his crustaceans against an official chart and hold the chef accountable for the significant size discrepancy. 42. Police in Nevada received a call in the dead of night from a man who wanted to file a formal complaint against the moon. He claimed it was committing unlawful entry of light by shining through his bedroom window and deliberately disrupting his sleep. He wasn't asking for advice on buying curtains. He was seriously requesting that an officer be sent to ask the moon to dim itself or move to a different part of the sky, as its constant presence was a violation of his right to a dark room. 43. Police in a coastal Maine town received a truly baffled call from a tourist. The man was reporting a theft of unimaginable scale. The items stolen? The entire Atlantic Ocean. He had planned an afternoon of swimming, but when he arrived at the beach, the tide was out. He genuinely believed the local authorities were somehow responsible and demanded to know where the water had gone, accusing them of hiding it and asking when they planned on bringing it back. 44. A woman called police, whispering that there was a silent intruder lurking in her hallway. She described him as a tall, shadowy figure with long, distorted arms that hadn't moved in over an hour. When the officer arrived, he cautiously investigated and found the suspect was the highly menacing shadow being cast by a coat rack piled with jackets. She knew it was a shadow, but insisted it was behaving suspiciously and wanted the incident documented in case it decided to do something later. 45. Dispatch received a call from a man who wanted to report an incident of unsolicited positivity. A barista had written, "Have a great day," on his coffee cup, and he considered it a gross invasion of his personal emotional space and an aggressive personal instruction. He told the dispatcher he did not want to be commanded on how to live his life by his coffee, and wanted to know if he could file a harassment charge against the overly cheerful employee for forcing pleasantries upon him. 46. A man called the police on his neighbor's 10-year-old son. The complaint wasn't about the noise from dribbling a basketball, but the exact opposite. The kid was apparently a basketball prodigy and almost never missed a shot. The caller was being driven mad by the constant, repetitive, and frankly arrogant swishing sound of the net, and claimed it was a form of psychological torture. He wanted the police to tell the kid to miss a few shots on purpose for the sake of neighborhood peace. 47. A woman in a high-end department store called 911 to report a case of deliberate emotional distress. The perpetrator was a mannequin in the front window display. The caller tearfully explained that the mannequin was impossibly stylish and better dressed than her, and its smug plastic face was making her feel deeply inadequate about her own life choices. She demanded the store be forced to remove the personally offensive and emotionally damaging display. Has a store mannequin ever made you question your life choices? 48. A man called 911 from a public library to report a book for being a public health hazard. He had just finished a novel with a sad ending and claimed it had maliciously ruined his otherwise pleasant afternoon. He argued that books with depressing conclusions should come with a government-mandated warning label, much like a pack of cigarettes, and wanted this particular one removed from circulation before it could inflict emotional damage on another unsuspecting reader. 49. In a call that perfectly blends technology and delusion, a woman reported her new smart toaster for assault. She claimed that after she entered the settings for lightly toasted, the appliance deliberately burned her bagel to a charred crisp. She was convinced it wasn't a malfunction but a calculated malicious act by the toaster's nascent artificial intelligence. She wanted to know if she could press charges against the appliance itself for property damage and intentional infliction of breakfast-related distress. 50. A man at a park called police to complain about the ducks in the pond. His issue wasn't their noise or their mess, but their complete and utter lack of organization. He was deeply agitated that they were swimming around chaotically instead of in neat, orderly lines. He requested an officer with animal handling experience come down and direct the ducks into a proper V formation, as their flagrant disarray was offending his sense of civic order. 51. A man in Washington state called police to file a complaint against the sky. He wasn't upset about the rain or sun. His issue was with the clouds. He described them as lazy, uninspired, and blob-like, claiming they were ruining the aesthetic of an otherwise beautiful day. He seriously asked the dispatcher if the city had a department responsible for sky quality control, and suggested they do something to create more interesting, artistically pleasing cloud formations for the taxpayers. 52. Dispatch received a late-night call from a man reporting a disturbance of the peace in his backyard. The offenders were a group of crickets. His complaint wasn't just about the noise, but its quality. He insisted they were chirping aggressively off-key and completely out of sync with each other, creating a chaotic symphony that was grating on his nerves. He wanted an officer to come and somehow restore musical order to his property. What's the most annoying sound in nature that you wish you could just turn off? 53. Case file: Postal dispute. A man called 911 on his mailman for deliberate emotional sabotage. It was the week of his birthday, and the mail carrier had delivered a stack of bills 3 days in a row before delivering a single birthday card. He was convinced this was a calculated move by the postal worker to ruin his birthday spirit. He wasn't claiming mail theft, but a targeted psychological campaign delivered right to his mailbox, and he wanted the carrier reprimanded. 54. A woman at a city plaza called 911 to complain about a public water fountain. The fountain wasn't broken or dirty. Her issue was with her reflection in the rippling water. She claimed the fountain was maliciously distorting her image and making her look unflattering. In her view, this was a form of public property damaging her self-esteem, and she demanded the city shut it down immediately until it could provide a more accurate and complimentary reflection for passers-by. 55. A man in Connecticut called 911 in a panic after an ATM dispensed far too much money. He'd requested $200 but received nearly $4,000. The responding officer arrived to find not a crime scene, but a man terrified of his own good fortune. The official police report simply noted the suspect was advised to contact his bank. Filed under. The only crime here was a fundamental misunderstanding of how bank errors work. So, from lazy clouds to judgmental statues, it's clear that for some, the line between an emergency and a minor inconvenience is basically invisible. Now, I want to know, and be honest in the comments. What's the dumbest, most trivial you have ever been secretly tempted to call the police about? If you enjoyed the absurdity, hit that like button and subscribe for more. We'll see you in the next one.